The Ashanti Kingdom, a powerful West African state, emerged in the late 17th century under the leadership of King Osei Tutu. Located in what is now Ghana, the Ashanti's rise was marked by uniting a diverse set of smaller states and tribes. Osei Tutu, with his visionary leadership, consolidated power and laid the foundation for a centralized kingdom that would rival any in West Africa. His most significant achievement was the creation of a strong military force and the establishment of Kumasi as the kingdom's capital. The Ashanti military became known for its strategic ingenuity and its warriors, who were trained to fight fiercely and fearlessly. Osei Tutu's rule also brought political stability through the establishment of a well-organized structure. The Ashanti Confederacy, a council of chiefs, worked closely with the king to govern and maintain unity. The kingdom was built on a foundation of trade and cultural cohesion. The Ashanti were rich in gold, and their control over gold mines positioned them as an economic powerhouse. Gold was not only the source of wealth for the kingdom but also a key item in transatlantic trade, making the Ashanti a significant player in the global economy. Their strategic location allowed them to dominate trade routes, and their control over gold was critical to the region's economy. The military culture of the Ashanti was formidable. They were known for their discipline, advanced weaponry, and military tactics. The kingdom's soldiers were trained to be elite warriors, equipped with weapons such as muskets, swords, and spears, and they used their knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver enemies. This military prowess made the Ashanti a formidable force in the region, and their growing influence began to attract the attention of European powers, particularly the British. The British Empire, expanding its colonial ambitions in West Africa, saw the Ashanti as an obstacle to controlling the gold trade and securing routes for its imperial interests. In the early 19th century, as the Ashanti Kingdom grew in power, the British Empire sought to expand its colonial foothold in the region. The Ashanti, with their rich resources and strong military, became a target for British conquest. The conflict began when the British attempted to interfere with the Ashanti's control over gold and trade routes. The Ashanti Kingdom, under the leadership of their kings, was resolute in maintaining its independence. King Osei Tutu's legacy laid the groundwork for the Ashanti's defense, with the kingdom's military preparing for the inevitable clash with the British forces. As tensions escalated, both sides began to gear up for a confrontation that would be marked by fierce resistance, strategic military moves, and the bloodiest battles in the history of West Africa. The Ashanti Kingdom's fight to preserve its sovereignty would soon become legendary. By the early 19th century, the British Empire was aggressively expanding its colonial influence across Africa, and West Africa became a critical part of this imperialist agenda. The British were particularly interested in controlling the region's lucrative gold trade, which was dominated by the Ashanti Kingdom. The Ashanti had successfully monopolized gold production and trade for centuries, making them an invaluable partner to European traders. However, as the British sought to increase their presence on the Gold Coast, what is now modern-day Ghana, they saw the Ashanti as both a powerful ally and an obstacle to their imperial ambitions. Their growing interest in Ashanti land and resources would eventually ignite tensions. The Ashanti, with their strong military and well-established trade routes, presented a significant challenge to the British. The British Empire was keen on controlling the entire West African coastline, establishing colonies that could serve as bases for resource extraction and trade. At the same time, they sought to protect their interests in the transatlantic slave trade, which was still an economic pillar for European powers. The Ashanti's resistance to British control of trade routes and their wealth in gold made them a target for colonial expansion. British officials in the Gold Coast region began making overtures to Ashanti rulers, hoping to negotiate peaceful terms of trade, but these overtures were met with suspicion and hostility. As the British attempted to expand their sphere of influence, the Ashanti Kingdom's response was firm and resolute. The Ashanti had a long-standing tradition of resisting external interference, and they viewed the British as foreign invaders threatening their sovereignty. The Ashanti's resistance to British economic expansion was not just about gold but about preserving their cultural identity and political autonomy. Their rulers were determined to maintain the kingdom's independence, and they recognized that British domination would not only mean the loss of control over valuable resources but also a deep affront to their political structures and way of life. Tensions escalated when the British began demanding that the Ashanti cede control of key trading routes and accept British diplomatic representation in their court. These demands were seen as a direct violation of Ashanti sovereignty. The Ashanti, who valued their independence and had successfully resisted earlier European incursions, rejected British overtures and refused to submit to British authority. The British, however, were determined to assert their control over the region, believing that subjugating the Ashanti was essential for the consolidation of their imperial ambitions on the Gold Coast. What followed was a steady build-up to conflict, as both sides braced for confrontation. By the early 19th century, the British Empire was aggressively expanding its colonial influence across Africa, and West Africa became a critical part of this imperialist agenda. The British were particularly interested in controlling the region's lucrative gold trade, which was dominated by the Ashanti Kingdom. The Ashanti had successfully monopolized gold production and trade for centuries, making them an invaluable partner to European traders. However, as the British sought to increase their presence on the Gold Coast, what is now modern-day Ghana, they saw the Ashanti as both a powerful ally and an obstacle to their imperial ambitions. Their growing interest in Ashanti land and resources would eventually ignite tensions. The Ashanti, with their strong military and well-established trade routes, presented a significant challenge to the British. The British Empire was keen on controlling the entire West African coastline, establishing colonies that could serve as bases for resource extraction and trade. At the same time, they sought to protect their interests in the transatlantic slave trade, which was still an economic pillar for European powers. The Ashanti's resistance to British control of trade routes and their wealth in gold made them a target for colonial expansion. British officials in the Gold Coast region began making overtures to Ashanti rulers, hoping to negotiate peaceful terms of trade, but these overtures were met with suspicion and hostility. As the British attempted to expand their sphere of influence, the Ashanti Kingdom's response was firm and resolute. The Ashanti had a long-standing tradition of resisting external interference, and they viewed the British as foreign invaders threatening their sovereignty. The Ashanti's resistance to British economic expansion was not just about gold but about preserving their cultural identity and political autonomy. Their rulers were determined to maintain the kingdom's independence, and they recognized that British domination would not only mean the loss of control over valuable resources but also a deep affront to their political structures and way of life. Tensions escalated when the British began demanding that the Ashanti cede control of key trading routes and accept British diplomatic representation in their court. These demands were seen as a direct violation of Ashanti sovereignty. The Ashanti, who valued their independence and had successfully resisted earlier European incursions, rejected British overtures and refused to submit to British authority. The British, however, were determined to assert their control over the region, believing that subjugating the Ashanti was essential for the consolidation of their imperial ambitions on the Gold Coast. What followed was a steady build-up to conflict, as both sides braced for confrontation. In 1824, the British began a military campaign against the Ashanti, marking the beginning of a series of bloody wars. The initial conflict stemmed from a British demand for Ashanti leaders to submit to British authority, which was met with refusal. The Ashanti king, King Osei Bonsu, and his generals rallied their forces to defend their land, and the First Anglo-Ashanti War began. This war would set the stage for future confrontations, with the Ashanti warriors showing remarkable resilience in the face of British military might. For the British, the Ashanti Kingdom was a significant prize in their colonial conquest of West Africa. For the Ashanti, it was a fight for survival, sovereignty, and the preservation of their way of life against a European empire that would stop at nothing to dominate the continent. The battle lines had been drawn, and the course of history would be shaped by the fierce resistance that followed. The First Anglo-Ashanti War, which erupted in 1824, was the first major military conflict between the Ashanti Kingdom and the British Empire. It was triggered by a complex set of factors, including British imperial ambitions and Ashanti resistance to foreign interference. The British had long coveted the Ashanti's wealth, particularly their control over gold, but the tipping point came when a British envoy, Sir Charles McCarthy, was killed during a diplomatic mission in the Ashanti court. This event provided the British with a pretext to wage war, using the death of their representative as justification for military action. The Ashanti, led by King Osei Bonsu, were resolute in their determination to defend their sovereignty. The Ashanti Kingdom was known for its powerful military, and the king's generals were highly skilled tacticians. Despite the significant military advantage that the British held in terms of technology, with their well-equipped army and naval support, the Ashanti soldiers relied on their guerrilla tactics, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and fierce combat skills to counter the British forces. The Ashanti warriors were also supported by their extensive network of allies and had a deep cultural commitment to defending their homeland from foreign invaders. The war began in earnest when British forces, under the command of Major General Sir Charles McCarthy, launched a series of raids on Ashanti territory. The British strategy aimed at weakening the Ashanti by capturing key cities and disrupting their trade routes. However, the Ashanti responded with a counteroffensive, using their highly disciplined and organized military units. One of the defining features of the Ashanti military was their disciplined ranks, their impressive use of firearms, and their leadership, which inspired fierce loyalty and resolve in battle. The Ashanti managed to inflict heavy losses on the British forces during the early stages of the war, and the British campaign quickly stalled. Despite the Ashanti's fierce resistance, the British were able to secure some victories, largely due to their superior firepower and the support of allied African groups who were allied with the British. However, the conflict proved to be far more challenging than the British had anticipated. The British underestimated the Ashanti's military strength, as well as their cultural unity and resolve to protect their homeland. The war dragged on for several years, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The Ashanti Kingdom, despite being under pressure, managed to defend its core territories and maintain its sovereignty in the face of the British onslaught. In 1831, a peace treaty was signed, effectively ending the First Anglo-Ashanti War, though the terms were not entirely favorable to either side. The treaty recognized the Ashanti Kingdom's right to remain independent but also required the Ashanti to pay a hefty tribute to the British, signaling a temporary compromise rather than a definitive victory for either side. The war left deep scars in both the Ashanti and British communities, with each side becoming more determined than ever to assert their dominance. The Ashanti, having demonstrated remarkable resilience, were able to maintain their independence for a time, but the war's aftermath set the stage for future conflicts. The British, despite their failures, continued to view the Ashanti Kingdom as a major obstacle to their imperial ambitions, and the tension between the two powers would continue to simmer, eventually leading to another, even more devastating confrontation. The Second Anglo-Ashanti War, which took place between 1863 and 1864, was a critical chapter in the prolonged conflict between the Ashanti Kingdom and the British Empire. By this time, the British had made significant strides in consolidating their control over the Gold Coast, yet the Ashanti Kingdom remained a powerful and independent entity that posed a serious challenge to British imperial ambitions. Tensions between the two powers had escalated following the First Anglo-Ashanti War, as the British sought to reassert their dominance in the region. The Ashanti, under the leadership of King Kwakadua, were determined to preserve their sovereignty and control over the gold-rich lands that had made them a target for colonial expansion. The immediate cause of the war was the British desire to extend their influence in the Gold Coast region and secure more favorable trade agreements. In 1863, the British demanded that the Ashanti Kingdom pay an increased tribute as part of the conditions of the peace agreement from the previous war. The Ashanti leadership, still deeply resentful of British interference, refused to comply. Furthermore, the Ashanti were growing increasingly wary of British expansionist intentions, which threatened not only their political autonomy but also their economic interests. The British, on the other hand, were intent on gaining control over the entire coast and ensuring that the Ashanti could no longer challenge their dominance. The British response to Ashanti defiance was swift and aggressive. In 1863, British forces, led by Sir Garnet Wolseley, began a military campaign aimed at subduing the Ashanti once and for all. The British strategy involved the use of superior firepower and the mobilization of local African allies, including the Fanti people, who had previously fought alongside the British during the First Anglo-Ashanti War. The British believed that their advanced weaponry, including firearms and artillery, would overwhelm the Ashanti defenses. However, the Ashanti were well prepared for another confrontation and had learned from their earlier encounters with the British. The Ashanti military, led by King Kwaku Dua and his generals, employed a combination of defensive tactics and direct engagement to repel the British invaders. The Ashanti warriors, known for their resilience and bravery, used guerrilla warfare tactics, taking advantage of their intimate knowledge of the dense forests and challenging terrain of their homeland. While the British had the technological advantage, the Ashanti's military organization and deep-rooted commitment to defending their kingdom made them formidable adversaries. The Ashanti forces managed to inflict significant casualties on the British, forcing them to halt their advance and reconsider their strategy. Despite the fierce resistance, the British ultimately succeeded in forcing the Ashanti to the negotiating table. The war ended in 1864 with a peace agreement that saw the Ashanti forced to pay tribute once again, but the British were unable to fully subdue the kingdom. This temporary peace masked a deeper unresolved tension between the two powers. The Ashanti Kingdom, despite suffering defeats, had managed to retain its independence, demonstrating the limits of British military power in the region. For the British, however, the war had exposed the Ashanti's formidable strength and resilience, making them realize that conquering the Ashanti would not be as easy as they had anticipated. This uneasy peace would only set the stage for a more intense and final confrontation in the years to come, as the British prepared for their third and most decisive campaign against the Ashanti Kingdom. The Third Anglo-Ashanti War, fought between 1873 and 1874, marked a critical chapter in the struggle between the Ashanti Kingdom and the British Empire. The Ashanti Kingdom, despite its resilience in earlier conflicts, now faced an even more determined British Empire, which had set its sights on fully subjugating the kingdom and consolidating control over the Gold Coast. For the British, the war was seen as the final step in quelling Ashanti resistance, while for the Ashanti, it represented a desperate battle to preserve their sovereignty. The British Empire, after their unsuccessful efforts in the first two wars, was determined to expand its influence in West Africa. The Ashanti, under King Kofi Kere, refused to submit to British demands, including the cession of crucial gold-producing regions. The British, having suffered earlier setbacks, recognized the need for a large-scale military campaign. In 1873, Sir Garnet Wolseley led a force of more than 2,000 British soldiers, accompanied by local allies, into the heart of Ashanti territory. Their goal was clear: to defeat the Ashanti army, seize control of the capital, Kumasi, and establish British authority once and for all. The British forces were well equipped, using modern firearms, artillery, and logistical support, a clear advantage over the Ashanti. However, the Ashanti warriors, known for their resilience and expertise in guerrilla warfare, fought fiercely. The Ashanti forces, commanded by King Kofi Kere and his generals, relied on their deep knowledge of the local terrain, using the dense forests and difficult landscapes to their advantage. Their ability to launch surprise attacks on the British troops made the conflict more costly and prolonged than the British had anticipated. Despite their tactical brilliance, the Ashanti were overwhelmed by the superior firepower and resources of the British. The British army pushed forward, defeating the Ashanti in several key engagements and ultimately reaching the capital, Kumasi. Ashanti defenders put up a fierce fight, but the city was eventually captured in early 1874. King Kofi Kere and his court were forced into submission, and the British imposed harsh terms, including the payment of tribute and the cession of territories. However, the defeat did not come without significant resistance, and the Ashanti warriors had demonstrated remarkable resilience throughout the campaign. Although the British emerged victorious, the war's outcome left lasting scars on both sides. The Ashanti, though defeated, had fought with unmatched determination and bravery, maintaining their identity as a proud and formidable kingdom. The British, despite their military success, realized that the Ashanti could not be easily subdued and that full control over the region would require constant military presence. The Third War effectively marked the end of the Ashanti Kingdom's independence, but the spirit of resistance continued to influence future anti-colonial exploit across Africa. The Fourth Anglo-Ashanti War, which culminated in 1896, was the final and most decisive conflict in the British campaign to conquer the Ashanti Kingdom. Following the Ashanti defeat in 1874, the British maintained a heavy presence in the region. The Ashanti Kingdom, though officially subdued, remained a thorn in the side of the British Empire. King Prempeh I, who ascended the throne in 1888, was determined to reclaim his kingdom's sovereignty and resist British efforts to completely annex the Ashanti. Under his leadership, the Ashanti Kingdom would again confront the British in a fight for survival and independence. King Prempeh's rise to the throne marked a new phase of Ashanti resistance. Determined to safeguard the kingdom's autonomy, Prempeh rejected British demands for greater political control over Ashanti affairs. The British had continued to encroach upon Ashanti territory, and the imposition of British political structures and economic policies became increasingly oppressive. The Ashanti people, led by Prempeh, had been patient, hoping that the British might honor previous agreements. However, by the 1890s, the British Empire, seeking to consolidate their hold over the entire Gold Coast, decided to force a final submission. The war officially began in 1895 when British forces, under the command of Sir Francis Scott, initiated a series of military maneuvers aimed at removing King Prempeh from power. The British strategy involved using both military might and diplomatic pressure to undermine the Ashanti king's authority. Prempeh's response was one of defiance. He led his warriors in battle, employing his knowledge of the terrain and his army's fierce determination to defend their land. While the Ashanti had learned from their earlier conflicts, they were faced with overwhelming odds. The British forces had advanced artillery, superior weaponry, and an expanded army, outmatching the Ashanti in both technology and resources. Despite the Ashanti's bravery and strategic defenses, the war tilted in favor of the British. King Prempeh's forces were unable to hold back the sustained British advance. The British troops systematically captured key Ashanti towns and strongholds, pushing deeper into Ashanti territory. One of the key moments in the conflict came when the British seized the Ashanti capital of Kumasi. King Prempeh, in the face of defeat, retreated into the interior, hoping to rally support for further resistance. However, the British forces, aided by their local allies, surrounded Prempeh's position, forcing him into surrender. In 1896, King Prempeh was captured and exiled to the Seychelles, marking the formal end of the Ashanti Kingdom's independence. The British annexed the Ashanti territory and incorporated it into the Gold Coast colony. Prempeh's defiance, however, became legendary. Though defeated, the Ashanti resistance was far from over. The courage shown by King Prempeh and his warriors inspired future generations of African leaders to stand up against colonial domination. The British conquest of the Ashanti Kingdom signaled the end of an era of resistance, but it also laid the foundation for the growing African nationalist movements that would rise in the 20th century, seeking to reclaim the continent's freedom from European imperialism. The British conquest of the Ashanti Kingdom in 1896 marked the end of one of the most formidable and enduring African resistances to European colonialism. After the capture and exile of King Prempeh, the Ashanti Kingdom was officially annexed by the British Empire, and the region became part of the British Gold Coast colony. This marked the final subjugation of a kingdom that had long defied European imperialism, but the legacy of Ashanti resistance would live on far beyond their formal defeat. The repercussions of the British conquest were profound, both for the Ashanti people and for the broader context of colonial Africa. In the aftermath of the war, the British imposed harsh political and economic measures on the Ashanti. The kingdom's wealth, once derived largely from its control over gold, was now directed toward supporting the British colonial infrastructure. The Ashanti's political system, once a highly organized and independent structure with its own kingship and councils, was replaced by a colonial administration. The British, however, were aware of the need to maintain a semblance of stability in the region, given the lingering resentment and the Ashanti people's strong cultural ties to their traditional rulers. While King Prempeh had been exiled, the British allowed for the installation of a puppet ruler, though his authority was heavily circumscribed by British interests. Despite their political defeat, the Ashanti people did not accept British rule passively. The spirit of resistance remained alive in the hearts of many, particularly among the Ashanti warriors and the descendants of those who had fought in earlier conflicts. The Ashanti had fought fiercely to preserve their sovereignty, and though their kingdom was no longer an independent entity, the legacy of their military prowess, cultural strength, and defiance remained a powerful symbol. Ashanti influence did not simply vanish, it endured through resistance movements and rebellions that would eventually sweep across Africa in the face of growing colonial oppression. The Ashanti Kingdom's downfall also had a profound impact on the broader history of African resistance. It demonstrated that, while military technology and imperial strategy could ultimately subdue a kingdom, the cultural and psychological impact of resistance was far-reaching. The Ashanti Wars, particularly their fierce battles against the British, became iconic symbols of African resistance, inspiring anti-colonial movements throughout the continent. The history of the Ashanti struggle, from their initial victories to their ultimate defeat, contributed significantly to the broader narrative of African nations' fight for freedom and self-determination. The conquest of Ashanti did not signify the end of African resistance, instead, it set the stage for future independence struggles across the continent. The defiance of the Ashanti, particularly King Prempeh's unyielding leadership, left an indelible mark on African consciousness, fueling the rise of nationalism and independence movements that would eventually lead to the decolonization of Africa in the mid-20th century. Though the Ashanti Kingdom was no more, its spirit of resistance endured, providing inspiration for the generations of Africans who would rise up to challenge colonial domination and reclaim their sovereignty. The Anglo-Ashanti War is a testament to the indomitable spirit of resistance that defined Africa's fight against European colonial powers. The Ashanti Kingdom, through 4 brutal wars, demonstrated courage, resilience, and an unyielding commitment to preserving its sovereignty. Despite the eventual British conquest, the legacy of the Ashanti remains a powerful symbol of African strength and resistance, inspiring generations of Africans who would continue the struggle for freedom. The story of the Anglo-Ashanti War is not just about the past, it's a reminder of the enduring power of cultural pride, the cost of empire building, and the deep desire for self-determination. If this story resonated with you, be sure to like, comment, and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful tales of Africa's untold histories.